Last Friday we had what was mostly a joke presentation from one of the students doing covering of course some call affairs and others great. It was really a it's really asking the bigger
Decapitate.
This client was like schizophrenia because I don't know why. They said like Taurus is like that's
Hey everybody. Let us find a seat and begin. So, hello everybody. Welcome to, what was it? Pizza and PowerPoints, the subtitle of which is Paschal Apologetic Presentations. So that's why it's P to the fifth. Many apologies about the late response. There were difficulties of the technical nature and of the pizza nature, which are continuing. Alan's gonna get here relatively soon, and we will have the pizza and stuff. But he has asked that we just go ahead and get started. So Ben and David are also gonna have to miss some of it. That's too bad. But we have 4 really great talks tonight, rather than just one. But they're going to be shorter, so don't worry about that. Let's see. I'm going to randomly select among the 3 who are not Ashton, somebody to go first.
what did I do?
No, it's just for the context. We had 20-minute presentations. One of the 4 of which has 135 slides, right?
Give or take.
Yeah, so he's going to skip just a little bit of it, but to be able to make sure he has a little bit of bonus time, well, he'll go last. But I'm going to randomly, going to put it in Excel 3 times rand. And let's see, so I'll be 0 to 1, Kevin 1 to 2. Is Kevin here? Yeah, 1 to 2, Cello 2 to 3. And it is 1.79, so Kevin will go first. Let's see. And you are here on the Felix Culpa, and you can just hit the space bar to advance the slide and everything.
Fantastic. What do I do with this? All right. Just kind of like so. That is not working.
The clip goes down.
There it is.
Yeah, there you go.
All right.
Okay.
Fantastic. All right. So the focus of my talk is on the problem of evil and giving kind of a different alternative historic response to that problem. So as you may know, the problem of evil is usually presented as like a logical contradiction. It posits that if you have an omnipotent, all-loving and all-knowing God, then God should be able and willing and know how to prevent evil from existing. So why then do we see evil in the world? The usual way people will respond to this is by trying to show, well, at the very least, there's not actually a logical contradiction between the existence of God and the existence of evil, right? They'll start just by giving a defense, basically. And all a defense sets out to do is show that God and evil both existing is not necessarily a logical contradiction. However, this does not necessarily go as far as explaining why God would permit evil to exist. And the reason that's important is that even if we knock down the logical problem of evil, there's still the evidential problem of evil. Or we might also think of it as like the probabilistic problem, which is basically asking the question, how likely is it, given what we know about God, that he would also permit evil to exist? So Alvin Plantinga is a Christian philosopher who has written a lot about the problem of evil. He's mostly written about the free will defense, but he has also submitted a theodicy, that is an explanation for why God would permit evil, which he published a paper explaining this in 2004. And the title of this theodicy is the Felix Culpa theodicy. And Felix Culpa is a Latin phrase that comes from the Easter proclamation that is recited during the Easter Vigil, and the translation of that phrase is it's usually translated as "Oh happy fault" or "fortunate fall," something of that nature. And the relevant line from the proclamation is, "Oh happy fault that earned for us so great, so glorious a Redeemer." Now that is kind of a fantastic thing to say, almost outlandish. It's like we're talking about the fall here, the introduction of sin and evil into the world. Why are we calling this a happy thing? So this is a thought that has kind of existed in church history for centuries, really, but it hasn't really been explored in Christian philosophy that much until very recently. So the central argument that Alvin Plantinga puts forward is that the incarnation and the atonement are infinite goods for us, such that any world that contains the incarnation and the atonement are better than any world that lacks these features. Now, you might know that the atonement is Christ's paying the penalty for, or taking on the penalty for our sins upon himself. That means, though, that if the atonement is such a great good, well, that presupposes the existence of sin. But wait a minute. That means then that the best worlds, the ones that contain the atonement, are also worlds that contain sin in them. So if this argument works, what we're saying then is that not only are God and evil not logically contradictory, but that we might actually expect to see evil in the best possible worlds. So let's kind of unpack kind of that first thing. What makes the atonement then such a great thing? And to answer that question, I would kind of step back even further and ask, why did God create the universe in the first place? And, well, what I would argue from Scripture is that the reason God created the universe, well, first of all, we need to say that God in himself is perfectly holy, perfectly complete in himself. So he could have chosen not to create the universe at all, and that would have been perfectly fine. Like, God is completely sufficient in himself, so he doesn't gain anything from creation. Rather, the point of creation is to make himself known to his creatures, to demonstrate his glory, his attributes, so that we can know him, love him personally, and worship him as we were created to do. So, with that in mind, if the goal of creation is for us to know God, then the best creation is one where we know God most intimately.
Moving on to that and say, like, it's better that for people to know God by also knowing what it's like to not know him.
In a way, yeah. So, kind of expanding on that, the worlds where God's attributes are most clearly displayed are those worlds that contain the atonement in them, because the atonement is sort of God's ultimate act of love towards his creatures, that it most clearly demonstrates his mercy, his grace, attributes that we wouldn't really know or have any experience with if we didn't also experience the absence of those things. So that is why the atonement is such a good thing. And the reason I think we can say that this is an infinite good is that by having the capacity to know God in this way, like, we will be in relationship with God for eternity if we are in Christ. So for an eternity, we will have a deeper relationship with God than would have been possible if the fall had never occurred, if evil had never been permitted to exist. So the existence of sin then is what makes it possible for us to see God's attributes more clearly and experience a deeper relationship with him than would have been possible otherwise. Now, you may notice then that the way I presented this argument so far, it really only deals with the existence of sin and evil. But the problem of evil usually is also looking at not just moral evil, like actions carried out by moral agents, but also suffering. So why then does God also permit us to suffer to the extent that we do? And there's kind of two ways I think we can address this. One is that suffering kind of is a necessary logical consequence of the existence of evil. Evil, by definition, is us going against a perfect and holy God who is the source of everything true, good, and beautiful in the world. So if you're cutting yourself off from God, where does that leave you? That necessarily leaves you in a place that lacks truth, goodness, and beauty. And this necessarily is going to result in suffering. But more than that, kind of tying this back into the atonement. I mean, you can see from the verses that I'm citing up here that, and I can just go ahead and read them. This first one is, therefore we do not lose heart, though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but what is unseen, since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal, as 2 Corinthians 4:16 through 18. So what this is telling us is kind of, I guess I've already gone over this a little bit, but that the suffering that we experience in this world, first of all, is temporary, whereas the perfect and whole relationship with God that we'll experience in the new heavens and the new earth, that is eternal. And in light of that eternity, whatever we experience in this temporal, in this fallen creation, is going to, it's kind of like a limit in calculus. I can kind of talk about that since you guys are mostly math people here. It's like that limit. Sorry, Cello. That value is essentially approaching zero as you approach infinity. Furthermore, you can see from Philippians 3:10 through 11, where Paul writes, I want to know Christ, yes, to know the power of his resurrection and participation in his sufferings, becoming like him in his death, and so somehow attaining to the resurrection from the dead. So in some sense, even Paul himself even says somehow in this verse. So this isn't necessarily something that we can completely understand ourselves, but through our suffering, we are in some way participating in Christ's suffering for us. And that's sort of the instrumental purpose that our suffering serves. The suffering that we experience is part of the sanctification process of becoming more like Christ. And through that, we come to know God more intimately as well. Furthermore,
So is this for the probabilistic?
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So would you say this is like a more parsimonious explanation, or just like natural suffering, or do you have animal suffering? I know Alex O'Connor likes to bring that up.
Mm-hmm.
So do you address like animal suffering?
I don't really know how to address animal suffering specifically.
Okay.
Yeah. That is something that we could explore more. What I can say is that the Bible does tell us that all creation is groaning. Like, all creation is waiting to be made new, because the introduction of sin into the world affected everything, not just us and our character and our relationship with God, but everything else that was created was affected as well. Now, if you take a position, I know some people take a position that animal suffering may have even existed before the fall. I don't know what to do with that. I don't know how you can make sense of that position theologically. So that would be something to investigate more. And in kind of the history of like Christian philosophy and apologetics, this particular argument hasn't gotten really a whole lot of attention until relatively recently, even though it's kind of been around for a while. Like you can see shadows of it, and especially like the very old or very old church, like the first few centuries especially, is where you kind of see this kind of language used the most. But the arguments kind of are still kind of being developed. Now, the other thing that we can say about suffering, though, is that besides just using suffering as part of the sanctification process, suffering is also a way that God makes himself known. Like the first example that comes to mind for me is in John 9, when Jesus and the disciples come across a blind man, and the disciples ask Jesus, well, why was this man born blind? Was it because of his sin or because of his parents' sin? And Jesus responds, well, no, it was neither. It was so that the works of God could be made manifest through him. And then Jesus heals that blind man, restores his sight. So in that example, we can see that the reason for suffering in that instance was so that God could make himself known. Further, 2 Corinthians 1:3-5 reads, "Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in our trouble so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God. For just as we share abundantly in the sufferings of Christ, so also our comfort abounds through Christ." What this is saying is that we, the church, who are the body of Christ, are also a means of reaching out to people and comforting them. And this is kind of one of the main ways that God is actively dealing with evil in our time, is through the actions of his people. And kind of where I'm meaning to really draw this is that this is more than just an academic argument. Right? This is, if we really believe that the reason that God permits suffering is for us to know him better, to know his attributes better, because of the opportunity for his attributes to be demonstrated, whether directly by God acting in the world or through us, his church, we should be looking for opportunities to take part in that. So what I'm also kind of getting at here is that really one of the best apologetics for the problem of evil or the existence of suffering is us being present for people in their suffering. Really, when people are struggling with God permitting suffering in the world, it's usually not in this abstract academic way that we normally like to talk about it. That person almost certainly is suffering in their own lives. So just responding to their questions about suffering with an academic argument is kind of like in James, when James describes going up to like a starving person on the side of the road, and instead of feeding them, you just tell them, go be warm, be fed, and just telling them that without actually doing anything. When really what we're called to do in those circumstances is to actually feed and clothe the person. So kind of when the thesis of what I'm getting at here is that number one is yes, God does. We can ask these questions about God. Why does He permit suffering in the first place? Right? We can answer these questions and say that it's so that we can know Him better, know His attributes better, and know Him more intimately than we could have otherwise. But more than that, if we really believe that, then we should be demonstrating the love that God showed us first to other people as well. And that, showing people that hope, it's kind of like like in 1 Peter 3:15, we like using that verse in apologetic circles because that's the verse that tells us to always be ready to give a defense for the hope that you have within you. If you're going to give that defense, though, you first need to demonstrate that hope. So that's kind of what I'm getting at here. So thank you. All right. How are we doing on time? I think I moved through that a little faster than in kind of some of the practice runs I've done. All right.
Actually, that was perfectly on time.
All right. Do we have time for questions, or do we kind of want to move on straight to the next one? Kenneth, that's kind of the question for you.
I think we want to let people get some pizza soon.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, maybe we even overlap that with questions, or is that too hard to do? We could take quick questions.
Sure.
Keep things rolling.
I just had a thought about like the animal suffering, like
Mm-hmm.
pre-fall
Mm-hmm.
sort of idea. I think it might be similar to like the atonement. I was thinking
Mm-hmm.
about like how the atonement is applied to people before it even happened,
Mm-hmm.
somehow through time, or like
Mm-hmm.
God, like outside of time, perfectly balances it with like the butterfly effect and such that it works out. So maybe in the same way, whatever evil exists because of the fall is perfectly balanced and applied beforehand.
It's like maybe because humanity would fall, that in some sense creation was always groaning.
Yes. Somehow
Maybe.
the same way the atonement is applied before it even happens.
Maybe. Yeah, since the atonement applies both to people not only who lived after Jesus, but people before as well.
Yeah. And
Maybe.
Like, at their time.
Maybe. Sure.
Okay. I didn't hear the rest of it, but I'm sure it was amazing. So. It was really good. Okay.
All right.
In recompense. Okay.
I've been blessed.
We have the food. I ran all the way to my apartment to realize that I didn't have the paper plates.
I have those too. I brought them.
I thank you because I was FaceTime monitoring you for that.
Oh,
Yeah.
I texted you that you brought it
down
down on silent.
My phone is there, so I didn't.
Oh,
Yeah.
no wonder.
Okay. But here we go. People are already doing that, so I'm just going to yell out, "Bless, O Lord, your gifts to our use and us to your service for Christ's sake, and make us mindful of the needs of others. Amen." All right, let's take a break.
thank God. Thank God.
Good job.
Yeah. Yeah, they were like really good. Yeah, he was telling me about it.
That's pretty funny.
He got two
I love that Christ's first love guy.
Yeah. Give him a shirt.
They're your sons too.
Well, and they were talking about it on.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear that. You're welcome to have pizza. Okay. One more.
He's talking about the Old Testament. God.
Babylonian?
Something like that.
Yeah.
Well, I figured
That was the whole thing.
That was so much shorter.
You know, in psychopathology,
That's the argument I'm very definitely
Will there be dinner after? I guess probably not.
Carry that around in the car.
Oh yeah, no, I need to and you were able to answer any split screen for the sake of simplicity. A database and then and then how I am pronouncing night. That's fine. I think I can do it. Actually, that'll be my presentation.
I ordered,
And not just a random one.
and then they gave
I
me
still got
one
all
more
the
than I ordered. I told them about it, because I'm
The bottom, I love seeing that.
but they just sit me on. That's the way to do it right here.
Well, I am now.
Me?
Yeah, it has nothing
There was.
about
That is the question I needed answered.
You were the first one up.
Kenneth does in fact sit.
like acts.
Look, there's
They're
no
really running late here.
Evan, would you like to join? Got a little bit of the mere exposure effect on how like. So join our row. We were talking like. I'm saying we've got open.
So what did I miss primarily?
This lady or somebody used to use
And then I saw how
this lady was talking about like we have like using a opinion. This only dates like one and on her dating app she only Asian or she only found white men attractive. Asian men and she starts finding Asian men more attractive. And he told me directly just through you know yeah, it's really fascinating.
My stuff is theoretically real.
that was your professor.
Yeah, that's true.
I don't remember. It was a good example. It's a way. I mean, it was a relevant example to what we were talking about. It wasn't like a.
Stay out with the
Lost talking about like this podcast.
Oh, so wasn't the person what course?
Yeah.
I was like, oh, it was the professor.
No, it was an example. I think it's fascinating.
The backs of really.
And then
I know.
hit Earth and it adds to the size.
You better find us a ship.
It's fun to find this one back to me.
Don't y'all want some food? We got plenty there.
With all of this stuff. You don't take it, I will.
I was about to say, I will.
Well, it's kind of a little bit.
How many people die from
The main planet that you happen to be able to find.
mainly anorexia?
So I have to find a way to take
There's some people here who think I shouldn't have ice cream sandwiches, even if.
And
You never have enough ice cream sandwich again.
or I find some
and then anorexia is close behind.
very out of
But anorexia is kind of a self
We'll consider your
self-deletion type deal, you know, because it's like has a 6% mortality.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and do the random decision between Cello and me for who's going to go next.
One is mental disorders.
2 times rand. Okay, so 1, 0 to 1, 1 to 2. F9. Was I 1? Okay, then I'm next. Okay. There we go. Alright.
Very special. We have to diagnose. I have 6. No one else.
It's still a six-sided icy object. It's just
So I think,
okay, I love this talk already.
Okay, yeah, I'm glad that you do. All right. Okay. Huh?
That's the
Oh.
most,
I was
yeah,
gonna point it out if you didn't.
that's
Thank-
the most important thing.
Thank you, because I mean, if I didn't, then I just don't deserve even to be here. Yeah. Okay. As I try and center, excuse me as I get a drink, because I think that I'm going to need it. Okay. Wow. Huh? I'm all right. I have just been running around back to my apartment for absolutely no reason. So, yeah. This is fake Dr. Pepper because they didn't have any of the 2 liters of normal Dr. Pepper.
Is it Dr. Pibb or something?
Yeah. Mister, I think. He doesn't even have,
It doesn't even have a
he doesn't even have the doctorate, yeah. By the way, I noticed today that from the time that I remember, the prices of the 2 liters have roughly doubled. So just the state of the world for you. Okay. So the first time that I gave a presentation that was marginally related to apologetics was when I was in 2020 during COVID. I was trying to present a relatively similar thing to what Kevin was talking about, which is why would God allow what was happening in 2020 to happen? I thought it would be relatively useful for the people in the context of a church to have answers to those things, especially because one of the examples that I mentioned of opposition that Christians find, especially when it comes to the problem of evil, was found in Peter Boghossian, he was an atheist professor who created this group of people called street epistemologists, who essentially would go out and they would kind of stand in street corners, or they would talk to you, and they would really ask you about your religion, what do you believe, and they would essentially just continue to ask question after question after question about why do you know this particular thing. And so he also has to do with the talk that's going to come after me. This guy was very interesting because Dr. Boghossian started out as very vehemently against Christianity, so going so far as to say that being published in philosophy of religion should disqualify one from sitting at the adult table. However, Bethel McGrew is one who has done a good job of documenting this really kind of miraculous change in the way that Boghossian and some of the people of a similar persuasion have been talking. And now he says something a lot different. I'm no longer interested in taking out Christianity. He has found another sort of primary enemy in the marketplace of ideas. And he, in order to illustrate this, he, along with some other co-conspirators, if you want to call it that, released or essentially created what was called the scandal of the grievance papers. In the late 2010s, they ended up sort of they wrote as, they used pseudonyms, they wrote fictitious academic papers in well-respected journals that had to do with feminist theory, gender theory, race theory, things like that have to do with the critical social theory side of academic discussions. And they got published in a lot of these things while still doing a lot of very strange things. One example of this is they rewrote a section of Mein Kampf as intersectional feminism, and a journal accepted it. Another thing they did is where they wrote this, which criticized the behavior of dogs when they meet other dogs, with the humping of the other dogs, and they said that had to do with rape culture and that it was representative of sex inequality in the Western United States. That was how dogs interact with each other socially was a result of that. And it was published, and it was regarded as something of exceptional academic merit as well. The reviewers were worried we didn't respect the dog's privacy while we were inspecting their, yes. But they got published, that was the thing, and so they have recognized While they supported the study of these particular areas of critical theory, they believed that it was important to get those things right. And that's a completely unobjectionable thing to say. It makes perfect sense that we should study how humans interact with each other and everything. But they wanted to critique an environment that they had found themselves in where only those conclusions that were conducive to a certain political stance were allowed, and everything else was essentially made a pariah or excommunicated from a quasi-religious academia that they were opposed to. And so Bethel-McGrew documents Boghossian as sort of shifting from Christianity as a mental illness to a religion of postmodernism or an intersectionality religion where that's everything at least, as the real sort of enemy. Jonathan Haidt also continues to talk about this a little bit, where he says essentially it's a microaggression, or which he conflates with blasphemy, essentially to question the policies of affirmative action, for example. And this is a very fast reversal that has happened from the early 2010s to right about now, where there does seem to be a sort of turning a little bit away from what people regarded as an academic excess, and one that had actually taken on a lot of religious undertones, essentially replacing God with a different God of social causes, which are sometimes progressive, and sometimes they can be far right. The far right end of the political spectrum is equally guilty of this, especially when it comes to certain political personalities. Either way, social grievance had taken precedence over academic truth, and atheists are turning towards this and recognizing that that's a huge problem, in comparison to which Christianity is not all that bad and actually probably really good, because it provides people a standard of objective truth that they can operate on and really use as sort of a friend, an ally in this discussion. We have two choices when it comes to this. We can either laugh at this reversal and say, haha, God is a God of flipping the tables over, look at how the tables have turned. Or, we can accept this as an opportunity for those of us who want to think of themselves as sort of ambassadors for Jesus, people who want to defend the Christian faith. Because it is very good to study these things, and it is very good to fight injustice, absolutely. But we as Christians understand that the reason that we fight justice is because of what Jesus had done on the cross, satisfying God's justice and mercy at the same time. That gives us the ability to do everything that we do as Christians. Let's see. This is an opportunity because, what was I going to say? We can recognize this as an opportunity primarily because this is essentially the thesis of what I'm talking about. Academic progressive illiberalism is fundamentally reliant on Christianity. Tom Holland, not Spider-Man, whom we have talked about a lot in this past year, who wrote the book Dominion, talking about Christianity's past contributions to society, basically building Western civilization. He remarks that wokeism, this idea of wokeism, is actually fundamental to the history of Anglo-American Protestantism. The civil rights movement was absolutely a part of that, because the word woke originally meant, in the way that you would expect an Old Testament prophet to talk about it, waking from a state of being asleep, being unaware of the reality of a situation, to being aware of it, and wanting and able to respond against it in a way that perpetuates justice in society. It's a very Christian thing to do. He says the following: at the heart of Western civilization for centuries and centuries and centuries, I wanted to include all three of them, has been the figure of someone suffering an unjust death, dying because he couldn't breathe, if you remember 2020. But emancipation and equality, which are very good things, decoupled from the Christian contributions to those ideas, which are forgiveness and redemption, are very, very bad. Because if you remember the Barbie movie, essentially the society, which was originally sort of female-dominated, was switched to male-dominated for a little while, and then female-dominated again, but there was no sort of return to equality in the end of that movie. Sorry to spoil it for anybody, for those who have been itching to watch Barbenheimer again. Yes. So Holland essentially says here that a desire for equality without original sin, this idea of humans being depraved and wanting to always flip the tables over and over again, oppressed, oppressor, oppressed, oppressor, is an issue, because it becomes judgmental, and reconciliation that actually affects real change becomes impossible. This is a huge opportunity for apologists to hit two birds with one stone, or rather to baptize two birds with one bucket, if you want to call it that. We have a way in to, first of all, contend for the factual truth of Christianity, while at the same time making it more appealing by helping people to understand the real source of their own values. Those progressives who had sort of accepted those papers without really thinking about them actually relied on a lot of Christian understandings to form the ideas that they had, which means to that extent, those ideas are actually great ideas. But we want to help them understand the real source of their values. Even if they're not convinced by the evidence for Christianity following that, it might actually convince them to live a little bit better and more consistently, as you see Boghossian, Dawkins, a lot of formerly militant atheists doing, living more consistently with their inherited Christian values. And even if the priority would be that people be Christian, that's at least better than nothing, you know? And so I want to present tonight what's less of an argument than a tactic. Greg Kokel is from Stand to Reason. I've talked about him a couple of times. He wrote a book called Tactics, which wants to present Christians with a game plan for discussing their Christian convictions. He gives a nice fancy names to a couple of his tactics. I want to give you a little equation. He talks about the Columbo tactic, which is based off of Lieutenant Columbo from an old TV show, where he would solve mysteries by going up to people and just saying, I'm confused about this. Do you mind if I ask you a question? And he would do this over and over again until people were exasperated about him, but he had solved the mystery. And so this is essentially, Columbo means ask a bunch of questions. Steve Lee talked about this with us at a very good length last November, I believe. He also has a tactic called Rhodes Scholar, which basically means you got to know your stuff. It's important for you to know at least a certain amount of facts in order for you to defend Christianity in the public sphere. That's entirely the tactic of that. And when you put those together, I present the apologetic of your welcome, which means that I want to give you the steps for what I'm talking about here. First of all, somebody raises a non-factual objection to Christianity. This could be a moral objection, or it could be a political one. And you want to think about it. What is it? And which might not actually be exactly what they say. There might be something underlying the person you're the opposition to Christianity of what the person you're talking to. Second, you want to assess whether authentic Christianity would actually agree with your interlocutor's moral opinion. Does real Christianity have something to say about that? Third, you want to ask the question, might Christianity have actually created his or her moral opinion a little bit further down on the chain of causality, you know? Number four, you want to ask, describe to your friend here, your interlocutor, how his or her opinion makes more sense under a Christian worldview. And you know, if this person is sufficiently good-natured and knows you're not trying to like be out to get them or to offend them, you can actually say, you know, hey, you owe that to Christianity, you're welcome, if you want. But I don't recommend that in all situations. If somebody is offended, of course don't say that. But say, you can paint it in a little bit nicer words, you know. And finally, if it's helpful in the conversation, direct your discussion towards the facts, primarily about creation and resurrection. This, I think, is a parallel with an idea that is much appreciated in my denomination, which is the the Episcopal Church. Anyway, they have brought evangelism, this is actually kind of nice, back into their conversation. If you don't know, this is a mainline denomination that has not cared about evangelism for a very long time, and their numbers prove it. But except in Dallas, because we're better than that. But anyway, they've brought this back, but they've re-articulated the term evangelism in an interesting way. They're passionate about proclaiming the good news of Jesus Christ in our words and actions through the spiritual practice of evangelism. It's just a spiritual practice, not anything important. We seek, name, and celebrate Jesus' loving presence in the stories of all people, then invite everyone to more. There are good things about this, but there are also obvious liabilities to this approach. First of all, it rather generously assumes that Jesus is actively and consistently intervening in the lives of people who do not follow him, which is kind of a generous assumption, right? And also, it has absolutely nothing to say, well, you know, you have somebody who is doing really well, like I found this nice job or something like that, and you don't know if that was Jesus or anything, but you could say, hey, you know, God wants us to work, you know, and I want to invite you to a relationship with a God who places in extraordinary value on the joy of what we do. That would be good. But what if somebody has absolutely nothing going for them, right? What if they have, and also what if they don't have anything going for them that in a way that's entirely their fault, you know, as you see it at least. I imagine, like, if somebody has been unemployed for a very long time and you're going to try and evangelize them like this, and they're just desperate for work, it's not going to work, and it's probably going to leave them even farther from Christianity than they were in the first place. And so this is sort of the parallel, But I think that your welcome tactic has a little bit of an advantage on this, which is that even if your friend's perspective here is decidedly non-Christian, that doesn't mean that you're just stuck where you are. It doesn't mean that you can't continue your conversation on this tack. You can actually, you can treat their perspective as good insofar as it relies on Christian values, which for a lot of perspectives that you would say are very contrary to Christianity, actually can still be traced back to a foundation that is very Christian. And so to the extent that that's true, you can exploit that. You can take advantage of it to say, hey, I affirm the moral perspective about equality, about treating other people well, about freedom, whatever it might be. This is a good thing. Christianity has an immense amount to say about this. But if you're going to fully accept the origin of this idea that you have, you might have to reframe it a little bit and reapply the way that, or reconsider the way that you're applying this value, right? And so I want to go through some examples here. This is essentially the whole step, and the rest of the talk can really just be going through a couple of examples, because I'm the only one here tonight who's talking who thinks that the presentation doesn't really deserve any longer than the time that has been allotted. This is basically like the whole point that I wanted to say. But I'll say, we'll go through some examples just to drive in what you might be able to use this for. So think about this. I can't be a part of a religion that condones slavery, either in the present or in the past. We in Reasonable Faith have talked about this a lot. We've presented some evidence about why Old Testament slavery has no bearance on what we think of slavery, chattel slavery of African Americans in the 19th century, which was obviously awful, but very different from what you saw in the Jewish community, the Israelite community in that time, as well as what was happening in Christian households in the early centuries of Christianity. But those, and you can talk about the biblical reasons why the Bible does not nearly as strongly condone even that state of social organization as people might think it does. But what if, like me, you often forget those points, those talking points? You know, well, you can do something that requires you to remember a lot less. You can say a few things like, I absolutely agree that slavery is wrong, but I want to ask you the question, if you don't mind, why exactly do you say that? And your friend might say, well, you know, I think that people have a right to freedom, right? Which is very fair, because they absolutely do, but Christianity actually tells us why. And so you can ask a follow-up question. First of all, you ask the question, why do you think this? Which is step 2 of Columbo. I'll give you a short outline of that. First of all, you want to ask questions to gather information, which is the question, what do you mean by that? Question 2, you want to reverse the burden of proof, and so you want to have your friend explain their perspective adequately, which is step 2, how did you come to that conclusion? And then step 3, you can use questions to make a point in Greg Kokel's tactic here, which usually starts, have you ever considered that in some way? Right? It's a sort of non-combative way to suggest to your friend an idea that if they agree with it, you've kind of helped them just arrive at it themselves. So you're not like imposing something on top of them. You're helping them along with you as you discuss with your non-believing friend. And so you can ask this question. Have you ever considered whether it's possible at all for inalienable human rights, like you cited the Declaration of Independence right there, if he or she did, I don't know. Is it possible for those rights to arise if they didn't come from outside humanity? You know, and it's kind of will tie somebody up in knots if they don't believe that they are endowed by a creator with those inalienable rights. If they're endowed by simply evolution, then the logical conclusion of that is that the person with the most authority, descended from the most violent army or something, can usurp those rights, right? And there's no like objective moral standard by which your interlocutor can say, no, that would also be wrong. And so you can also provide a little bit of extra evidence if you want to really pack in the punch by maybe asking a question like this. Do you happen to know who was the first person ever recorded to speak out against all forms of slavery? If not, you can say, well, it was a guy named Greg. His name was Bishop Gregory of Nyssa in the 380s. And so it was a Christian bishop, right, who was the first one to say slavery in all of its capacities is absolutely wrong. You might also say, have you ever considered that St. Paul, one of the most prolific writers in the New Testament, listed slave taking in one of his lists of sins that he's so infamous for? You know, those things can be very useful. And then you can kind of drive in the point by saying, in a friendly way, I hope you understand that the greatest abolitionists pretty much universally relied on Christianity to make their claims, because they recognized that the right to liberty and life were given to us by God. So I actually think that you need Christianity in order to make this point that you're using to speak against Christianity. But then the real question becomes whether we have good reason to believe that we were created with intellectual rights or not. And this is the last step of the tactic. Would you like to talk about that? Right? And so now you've gone into a question, you've gone from slavery is wrong, yes, I completely agree. You actually owe this to Christianity, and you can put credit where it is due in this conversation. And now you've brought it to something that's even more important, which is the existence of God, who gave us these rights in the first place. What about another example? This one actually was given to me about a year ago at the last Res Fair. I don't even remember the context for it, but somebody told me, no thanks, I believe in science and stuff. Yeah, and for whatever reason, I was kind of busy, and so I didn't continue this conversation. But if I were smart, what I should have done was ask the question, well, what do you mean by believe in this case? Because we understand science is not an agent, right? It's not science as Mr. Science that I can call on the phone over there told me that God doesn't exist or something like that, or that miracles don't happen, right? No, science as this process of ciencia, of knowledge, is a method by which we acquire new knowledge. This is why we call things the scientific method. And so when you say believe in science, I would completely agree if you're saying that I accept the scientific method as a valuable means by which we can be delivered a truth, which makes perfect sense. I don't think anybody should deny that. But I have to ask you the question, my friend, why exactly do you believe that the scientific method can deliver truth? Because I can think of a lot of reasons why it wouldn't. The world is sometimes very unpredictable in some ways, which means that the things that we measure in scientific observation might not be correct. Or the way that we even perceive things in the world might be wrong. Our minds could just be, and one of those is like what I just said, the pattern can be unpredictable, could bring you into the teleological argument that the world looks designed because it actually does operate usually in a regular fashion. Or I could say, it could be that our observations are entirely unreliable because we've been sort of evolutionarily directed by nothing, of course, because it's evolution, but we've been directed without direction into just seeing those things that benefit us and allow us to reproduce, right? So that means that our observations could be entirely unreliable as well. This is the evolutionary argument against naturalism that we've talked about before. So I have to ask, do you believe in the basic reliability of your senses, right? And you believe in the general structure of the universe in a way that we can understand. As somebody has said, the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. But I have to ask you a question, about this. Does it make more sense if everything was evolved that the scientific method might work, or if the universe is just an accident that the scientific method might work? Or does it make a lot more sense for the scientific method to work if there is a God who actually wants us to understand his creation completely? And this is obviously why Christians invented the scientific method in the first place, essentially. And so we could take credit for this, not on our own, not because we Christians are more intellectual or something than other people, but because Christians contributed immensely to the development of science, which means that if you're going to use science in some way to step away from Christianity, you have to make sure that you are recalling and in some way giving thanks for Christianity's contributions to the scientific method in the first place. So you can ask a couple more questions on the Rhodes Scholar side of the tactic. Have you ever considered that the first research universities were founded by Roman Catholics because they think that God wanted them to study his creation? Or did you happen to know who founded the first modern hospital? Well, guess what? It was another bishop. It was Basil of Caesarea in 386, according to John Wyatt, and he thought of it as a place to practice Christian hospitality to guests because he thought it was important for us to serve people who couldn't care for themselves. Or you might ask, have you ever considered that the profession of nursing was initially practiced exclusively by Christians because they found it a way to serve the marginalized and the sick just like Jesus would, right? And so you can make the final point that ultimately the scientific enterprise stands not on the shoulders of giants, but on the shoulders of Christians. sort of an inversion of what Isaac Newton said, who believed the universe was created and therefore understandable, and they had a reason to use that knowledge to help others. But then you have to think about whether this belief was actually well-grounded. Did the Christians have a good reason to develop the scientific method in the first place? Because were they correct in believing that the universe was created and understandable? And now you've gotten back to the important question. This even works for things that are a little bit more controversial, such as abortion and homosexuality, in which Christians would be a little bit usually opposed to the way that a non-Christian would be approaching this. However, like I said with the Episcopal evangelism slide, it still has something to contribute. Christians are bigoted. They don't support a woman's right to choose. You have two tacks you can take. You can kind of hop between them on this question. You know, you can say, absolutely, I agree that a woman has a right to choose, but my question for you is the right to choose what? You know, and the answer would be the right to choose whether or not to have a baby. Absolutely, I agree that women should choose whether or not they have a baby. I just disagree on when that point of having a baby actually takes place. Because I understand as a matter of scientific knowledge, not really, the Bible doesn't tell me this, but science does, that from the point of conception, we have a unique, independent human being who is distinct from every other human being on Earth at that very point of genetic recombination, which means that it's actually fully wrong for us to kill this human being after it has been conceived. And so I'm just disagreeing with you on when this point of having a child takes place. Is it conception or is it birth? Is it somewhere in between? We can talk about that later. That's one of the tactics you can talk about. The other is you can talk about where this idea of bodily autonomy, which is the one that's talked about pretty often, comes from. And so you can mention Christianity's contributions to this, too. Women being treated essentially as property until the Protestant Reformation. And even before that, the fact that religious life was one of the first sources of autonomy and essentially dignity for women. Instead of being forced into marriages against their will, they could enter the Catholic religious life, and they would be respected. They would have the freedom to move in the way that their provincial superiors kind of would allow them to move, but still a lot more free than other places. And so, you know, even here, the idea of bodily autonomy, human rights, owes itself to Christianity in a really profound sense. If you were to talk about homosexuality, the question would be, it would be a little bit tougher, but you can still talk about things like the positive golden rule. Treat others like you would have them be treated, which was an idea that was not articulated in that way at all before Jesus came along. And so if your friend is saying, I should be able to marry somebody of the same sex just as you're able to marry somebody of the opposite sex, you can say, I agree with this perspective, absolutely, that we should have equal rights and not treat people unequally. I just happen to think that marrying somebody of the same sex is actually categorically different from marrying somebody of the opposite sex. And still, you can continue to have a conversation in that way. You have sort of disarmed your opponent here, rather. You've made them understand you're not out to get them. You're not out to destroy their idea. You're actually affirming where they are correct, and you just want to kind of help them understand where you are coming from. And at the same time, this is really the important question. You want to get to the point where Christianity is not only good, or at least not as bad as your friend thought it was in the first place, but actually true. It's important to make that shift. The question, a couple other semicolon, however, comma questions would be, you know, is your friend a high quality in the sense of like, is he good-natured enough to accept this in a way that if you were to sort of put credit for his ideas where it is due in Christianity, would he be offended at that? And so do you need to sort of wax your language in a way that makes a little bit more sense or is a little bit more palatable to that person? And then also you want to make sure that you remember the sort of dichotomy between ice cream and insulin that I think I've talked about once before. That if you were to say that ice cream is delicious, that is a subjective statement, but that's also how people treat religion all the time. But that's not the claims to truth that religions make. The religions make a claim that's a lot more analogous to saying that ice cream is a medicine that cures diabetes. That is not true, but even if it were true, it would be true for everybody and not just me. And so in the same way, ice cream is not the solution to diabetes, insulin is the solution to diabetes. And we believe in Christianity in an insulin kind of way, where the claims that we make about reality are separate from whether or not anybody even believes them. They would be true regardless, which means we have to keep that perspective of truth in mind as we go about this discussion no matter what. So there you go. Those are some tips about how you can use this tactic and sort of take and get on the bandwagon of atheists accepting the Christian origins of even their own ideas and use it for the best purposes. Okay. Any questions before I step down? Most excellent. All right. Oh, yeah.
I was going to basically ask a question that I could maybe see being a response from someone if you're in a discussion with them like this. I was talking about, all the great things Christianity did. Well, if Christianity was, so suited to cause all the advancements in science and moral rights and stuff like that, what took it so long? I mean, you mentioned women finally getting rights and stuff in the 1500s. Why did it take 1500 years if Christianity was really to do to that? Why didn't it happen a lot earlier? Same with the abolitionist movement. Why did that happen in the 1800s?
My answer to that would be it didn't. It didn't take that long. As soon as the resurrection had taken place, people's moral perspectives completely changed. And they were living in a way that was entirely radical in comparison to the societies that surrounded them. They had everything in common. They shared their resources. They treated their wives as equal to them. They even equal in dignity, maybe not equal in office. And they treated their children as equal in dignity to them, their slaves as equal in dignity to them. And that's why we see in the 4th century the examples of the bishops that I had mentioned, founding the hospitals and stuff like that, where we see all of these this social progress happening early before, this is the answer that I would really give, establishment of the church became a big thing. And it became a way to exert authority over other people, which I would say is absolutely a corruption of what Christianity was supposed to be in the first place, which is why Christianity plus political power equals usually nothing good.
Is it also fairly fair to say that a man's inability to enact the teachings of Jesus doesn't mean that Jesus' teachings are not true?
Absolutely. Another way of saying that is that religion should not be punished for the religion should not be punished for the crimes of their heretics, right? People who adhere insufficiently to Christianity shouldn't be punished for that.
Just to add real quick to that, Christianity did get rid of slavery in the first millennium.
Yeah.
As Roger Starks has documented. And they didn't have any power at the very beginning, so it couldn't make the Roman emperor stop it right away.
That's true.
Exactly.
Yeah. This will be the last question so we can get to Cello.
You don't have to do this now, but I would love to hear the rest of that homosexuality argument.
Yeah, I want to give some time to continue, but I will continue to think through it and sort of present you something a little bit more comprehensive if you want. Yeah. I'll now hand it off to Cello for global skepticism. I'm not sure. I don't know if this talk is going to be very good because I just don't know.
Okay, let's. Okay, mic check. Hello, friends. So I think Kenneth gave a great presentation on how we can use sort of the Socratic method to discuss with people about Christianity in a way that is digestible. However, I would like to bring up a very not an ideal scenario to the Socratic method when we're going through it. Say you meet someone, maybe at a school fair or at your local crochet club, and they find out you're a Christian and they ask you why. And you guys go down the steps of why you believe certain things, and then they continue to ask you why. Why is truth objective? Why does God exist? How do you know that he exists? Why is that sufficient? And they just keep on going and they never stop. Well, for me, that's a nightmare, and it has happened to me before. And so I wanted to try and present a primer of sorts as to how we can deal with individuals who don't believe that we can attain truth at all. It's a really tough crowd. So here are the table of contents for the sake of time. I'm going to go past them because you'll find out what I'm going to speak about anyway. To define global skepticism, I first want to establish that skepticism itself is not a harmful thing. Skepticism itself is usually from a very healthy place of a desire to cultivate an intellectually robust and sophisticated view of the world. And that is something that all Christians especially should aspire to. But what happens is that when we have skepticisms about why we believe certain things and how we came to that conclusion, we can soon find ourselves at a dead end when we keep on facing contradictions and obstacles in our logic. And there are some people who just stop at the obstacle and say, that's it, I'm done, I don't know anything. Matthew McGrath says the skeptic claims we lack knowledge or justified belief for both across an important domain. In the extreme case, the domain is universal. That is, we lack any knowledge at all or any justified belief at all. So that is what global skepticism is. And it's contrasted from local skepticism, which is the healthy kind of skepticism. You ask, why do I think that belief? Or how did I come to that conclusion? And to clarify, justification are the reasons for believing in something. However, when we speak about it in epistemology, it's more so used as a term of epistemic appraisal. Also, epistemic means epistemology is the branch of philosophy that figures out how we reach truth and how we know something. And so that's what epistemic means. So when I say that something is justified, when I'm justified in believing something, it does not mean that I simply have reasons for it. It means that I have very good, testable, and sound reasons for it. And that is what's the problem here, is that there are people who don't believe there can be any sound reasons for believing in things. And there's a quote by René Descartes, which is a healthy form of skepticism, but then it is taken too far. And another frustrating thing is that there is no academic consensus for how skepticism should be refuted, so we need to philosophize with much discretion. And as a disclaimer, this might be, this is certainly frustrating for me. Philosophy is a big jar of worms, and a big can of worms. When you open it, there's another one. When you open it, there's another one, and it's never ending. It can be very discouraging, and I'm not very confident in my ability to give you, to tell you how to think about these problems within 20 minutes. I don't know how to think about them myself, so what I intend to do is kind of give you guys the problems and the tools to grapple with it yourself, because I believe it is important. So why is it important? Well, it's kind of self-evidential. Global skepticism destroys virtually all beliefs under the argument that there are no justified beliefs. And the Christian faith is a very nuanced one that seems fantastical even to a non-believer who still believes in justified belief. So if we believe in a God who loves us and created the universe, you won't get the idea through a person who doesn't even believe that they exist, right? But even in the secular view, it's a problematic idea because human accomplishments lose value. Important philosophical projects such as ethics and knowledge are dismissed. You don't have ideas like good and evil anymore. You don't have ideas like a value or a reason for doing things. There is no purpose. And with this breakdown of the teleology of things like how society works and how we decide we want to live our lives, it's a counterintuitive way to live, but it is sadly a position held by some people. There's a quote by Bertrand Russell where he says, "Dogmatism and skepticism are both, in a sense, absolute philosophies. One is certain of knowing, the other of not knowing. What philosophy should dissipate is certainty, whether of knowledge or ignorance." And I think that is hard for us. Certainty feels safe, and we like to think that we know things for certain, but I do ask you that when thinking of epistemology, that we will have a bit of grace for ourselves in not being certain about the ideas we come across, because no philosopher ever has come to a certain conclusion about any of this. Yay! So there are two forms of global skepticism. First is Pyrrhonian skepticism, and it was named after Pyrrho, but he didn't even invent it himself, so I don't know why it's named after him. It questions whether we can trust logical processes to provide us with knowledge. And are all logical processes susceptible to self-contradiction and or incomprehensibility? So this deals with internal processes, like basic principles of induction and deduction. Pyrrhonian skeptics believe that we don't have ways of believing that the things we deduce or induce are correct. And that's propelled by the problem of regress, which I will go over. And then there's Cartesian skepticism. Descartes is a very big name in philosophy, and a lot of you guys probably know him as well. There's a Billie Eilish song about him. And it asks whether we can trust our minds to gather reliable information. This, Descartes questions whether sense experience can be trusted at all. And so they are global skepticisms for different reasons, right? If we can trust internal processes versus can we trust external processes. And this one's propelled by the doom and evil genius dilemma, which Kant gives us with, and also gave us a really cool movie called Matrix. Justification is a highly contentious subject, as you may have guessed. The standards of what necessarily warrants one idea to follow another is tricky, but a small definition that we can go off of is doxastic and propositional justification. Doxastic justification is to possess personal belief in something, and propositional justification is to possess, to understand that if you were in that epistemic situation, you would be justified in believing it without believing it in yourself at the present. That sounds confusing. So let me give you an example. Doxastic justification would be like if I were to say I believe that I'm an Asian girl. I have personal belief in this statement. But if I were to say that I'm propositionally justified in walking through the cold and coming into the door and I start shivering, but I don't feel cold, and yet I know that shivering is a symptom of your body being cold. So I'm propositionally justified in believing that my body is cold despite not having a personal belief in that. So those are also, this is something to consider, this distinction is something to consider when we're defining definitions for knowledge and whether a standard upholds. So that's one tool for you guys. And the definition of knowledge that we will be using in this presentation is Edmund Gettier's definition, which I think is the most accepted one. It's justified true belief, which is a classical formula, plus X. X is unknown. We will talk more about the X later. So first, let's go over Pyrrhonian skepticism. So what is the regress problem? Okay, we're going to compare justification to a tree. I'm going to draw a quick thing here because I didn't know how to put it on my slideshow. Let's see. There's proposition 1 and proposition 2, which leads to belief C. Let's say this. Say that this is kind of the roots of the tree. There's roots of the tree that uphold the higher node that is belief C, right? And we need proposition 1, proposition 2 to lead us to justify belief C. So proposition 1 could be the sun rose yesterday. And then proposition 2 is the sun rose every day for the past however long it's been. I've seen the sun rise for the past 20 years of my life. That leads me to belief C. I think that the sun is going to rise again tomorrow. And these two beliefs justify this one. But then, what justifies proposition 1 and proposition 2? These are also beliefs of their own. So then that requires another node, another lower node. So let's say there's another one. But then, what are we going to do? We also need to justify these. And then we can do this for a while. So this is the problem of regress in proofs, is that we don't know just how far we can get with tracing back our method of justification, and it seems like there really is no end. And this is based off the deductive closure principle of if you know P, and P entails Q, and you competently deduce Q from P, believing P as a result of the deduction, then you know Q. But then the problem of regress says that we are never in a position to know P, so we cannot know Q. we can't know P1 or P2, so whatever comes after that, we don't know. That's a very grim way of thinking. So there are three theories that we can make of this. We can be an infinitist. An infinitist says that there is an infinite amount of beliefs, of proofs that can be made. So P1, P2, P2, so like level 1, level 2, level 3, and then it goes on ad infinitum. And they say, that sucks, but we can still have knowledge because once you go down enough, it's probabilistic enough that we can believe that the original higher node is true. I think that an infinitist said, we can stop at like 15, maybe. I don't know why he chose 15, but you go down somewhere and you stop and you say, that's enough. You can do 16. And then there's foundationalism, which I believe is the more intuitive way of justifying our beliefs. It's saying that somewhere in this tree are baseline beliefs that just cannot go further. Just saying that's it, these don't require justification, and this forms the foundation for the entire tree. But this is a bit self-contradicting, as you can see, because what makes these beliefs not require justification, but these require justification? And when you try and explain why, you are justifying it. So then that leads to another tree that you have to justify, and then you take the whole day. That's exhausting. So let's try coherentism. What's coherentism? Coherentism this time does not rely on the truth of the ideas themselves, but relies on the connection of ideas, and it's how coherent they are in order to provide justification. So like the idea of sun and sky and moon and space and other ideas, these relationships is what makes sense of the individual ideas. And without the relationships, they wouldn't be able to be coherent. There would be no context for it, and therefore you would not be able to understand it. So that's how you justify it. But there's always a but. Let's say belief 1 justifies belief 2. This is the relationship. Belief 3, belief 4, belief 5. So then we come back. We will always come back if there is a network of justification. So it seems like there is a little bit of an uh-oh with all of these theories. Okay, so how do we respond to a Pyrrhonian skeptic when they say you cannot be justified in believing anything? Well, there is the commitment iteration principle, which is a little bit of a more rhetorical response, but I think it is a pretty effective one. You say, if you commit to a proposition, you're also committing to the belief that you possess a justified attitude in regards to the position, right? Because if you say something, you're not accidentally saying it. You believe that it is justified. And so for someone to say that they are unjustified in believing that nothing is justified, that is contradictory. And so when I was making this slide, I was thinking, all I've proven was everything is contradictory. But maybe that's a little helpful note for when you're going back to analyze Pyrrhonian skepticism. And there's other process reliability solutions, which is the X in the definition of justified true belief. Yes?
So this is the under the hood part of there is no truth, is that true?
Yes,
okay.
Kind of. So there are accounts of truth, of knowledge, that give us different standards for determining how something is justified. You can say something is, we know something when we're able to establish that A causes B. Or we are able to know something when belief A is sensitive to being true. That's a really hard one. It's by a guy named, I think his name is Reed. He says that truths can be tracked. And so if something weren't true, you wouldn't believe it in the first place. I don't know how I feel about that, but there's a defeasibility account, which says that if there are no defeaters to what you believe, then it is true. There is the no false accounts account, which believes that if there are no false assumptions to what you believe, then it is true, or then you know it. There is a relevant alternatives account, which believes that if you look at all the relevant alternatives and none of them contradict the thing you believe, then you can say you know it. So that is Pyrrhonian skepticism. But to move on to a more, stress-free form of global skepticism, here's a guy who believes in internalism. But how did he come to say that he can trust internalist ideas? Well, he first started by breaking down all of his beliefs, and he wanted to start at the very start. He wanted to start at ground one. And he proposed a scenario. What if you were dreaming right now? And whenever you dream, are you able to tell whether it is a dream or if it's real? If not, then, and whenever you're dreaming, you don't experience real things. And so unless you can prove that you're not in a dream right now, you cannot say that you believe in anything that is real. And then there's an evil genius dilemma, which says, forget the dream, say that there's an evil genius who has it out for you. And he places your brain in a vat and is simulating your brain to receive all sorts of electrical impulses that make you believe that there is a reality that you're currently experiencing. And so unless you can prove that there's not an evil genius who is personally torturing you to believe in your reality where you don't have a girlfriend, you're unemployed, it's then, unless you can prove that, you don't know anything. But so then Descartes comes to this problem of, okay, how do I even say what I am? What am I? But then that comes with cogito ergo sum. I thought of it, I'm able to doubt something, which means I'm a thinking mind. But then what? What else can we make of that? Where do we go from I exist to this network of ideas that justify the way we live and make decisions? Well, he says, experiences are involuntary, the mind is not. I can think with my mind, if I wanted to imagine a unicorn at will, I could do it. But if someone were to throw a bowl of salsa at me right now, I would not be able to control that, and I would get hit and it'd be painful. So there is something that is external to me. Oh my goodness, see, I could not have controlled that. And so there's something that's not my mind that I can't control outside of me. So what is that? There's something that is external to us. But how do we know that something external to us is something we can believe? Well, he actually argues that there's a good God. There's a good God who's necessary for trust in the external world. And this God, who is the source of all these ideas like 1 + 1 = 2, and the idea of infinity and goodness, these ideas that you can't really go further beyond in this tree of justification, those are given by God, because he's the one immovable mover that is the beginning place for all of our beliefs and everything that exists. I'm going to speed run these, but then there's also, you can argue that there are ideas outside of experiences that can prove that you are not a brain in a vat. And so you have your memory and perception, reasoning, and other minds. You can look at your memory, and things from dreams are blurry than the things you experience in reality. They are distorted sometimes. They don't apply to the laws of reality. So then you can see that there's a difference between reality and dreams. Then you can have the a posteriori arguments, which is relies on justification by explanatory inference. This is just a very complicated way of saying that if you believe in something and there's nothing that is, there's no defeaters to it, or there are no other theories that are more compatible with it, then you are justified in saying that you know it. And when it comes to our sense experiences, we don't really have any more probabilistic arguments for why we believe sense experiences are reliable. That's the best we can get. And then G. Moore, he's a really cool one. He says, well, I have one hand and I have another. And guess what? Brain in the vat can't have hands. And so I'm not a brain in the vat. And this is a really bold argument, but he says that this is valid because experiences give us the grounds for ordinary propositions about the world, which then gives us evidence to believe that we're not a brain in the vat. And so while we cannot make abstract propositions based on just experience alone, we can say, when we observe something, that is grounds enough to say that we are not brain in a vat. And then so conclusion, skepticism is tough, but we have intelligent responses to prove the validity of justified belief. Arguments for different definitions of knowledge establish that a fallible mind can still attain knowledge as long as we let go of this desire to ascertain every single thing. Certainty does not need to be a part of justification, but justification does need a certain standard. And let's remember that Christ prevails. Though philosophizing is great, it's not. Do not burden yourself with thinking that you must convert every skeptic in the world. Truth finds its way to those who need it. And that is all.
You actually signed your
I did. Oh, are there any questions? That was a lot, I'm sorry.
Okay, that's just like your opinion, right?
Oh yeah, that's my opinion.
Cello, wake up.
Wait. Wait, stop it! I just stopped watching Matrix. You can't do this to me. Yes?
Okay, I'm trying to like wrap my head around this. So,
I'm sorry, I drew a lot of you.
Yeah, but it was good. It was good.
We threw a lot at you.
It was information dense, and I don't think 20 minutes is a whole lot of time to do it justice, but it was very good. So I just, when it comes to Pyrrhonian skepticism, you were talking about how to address that, and you said there's like multiple ways to address it, but there isn't one defeater for it.
Well,
It's like,
I
what's the most
think
persuasive response?
I personally believe, and this is just my personal opinion, so it's very valuable. I believe that infinitism is the best argument because, well, we are finite beings, and when we try to get behind ideas like why does something exist as opposed to not exist, we cannot have any justification for it. You can theorize based on things that exist, but that doesn't get behind the mechanics of why existence is at all. And so that's where I throw in God, similarly to how Descartes did, and say we need God necessarily to show that there are causal relations between ideas to give us justification for beliefs, but there's also only a certain level of justification where we can arrive at, where we can say we have enough proof to say that we are justified in believing it, to say that we know it. But there are certain things that we just have to, in my opinion, concede and say we can't know. Like, why do I exist? I don't know. Sorry.
So to summarize, so like Pyrrhonian skepticism is based on like this regress problem.
Yes.
And justified truth belief.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that we can't always justify our beliefs like propositionally.
Yes, it's that every proposition requires justification, and that can go on forever.
Okay, I understand.
But doesn't that just kind of fall apart when you apply it to real life?
I suppose so, but if, for example, you can do it with mathematics, but it's another thing to say, we're going to use 1 + 1 to try and form a structured justification for how we gain meaning or how we know that the sun's going to rise tomorrow. Because we have probabilities, but we don't have ways of saying that we can necessarily deduct from this proposition that it's true.
Math really uses foundationalism because you're always appealing to certain axioms.
That is true.
Yeah. One more question, then we'll
Yeah. So, with all this information, and I'm not gonna lie, it was kind of difficult to follow at certain
So
points.
sorry.
But I'm trying to think from a practical sense when we're trying to discuss this with somebody who has not the time to hear all this amazing information. What would be the best way to apply this when we're having a conversation with somebody who believes or doesn't believe in any objective truth?
Something I usually do whenever I'm discussing with my existentialist friends is say, well, why do you say that you know this? And also, when you examine your beliefs, this is kind of similar to what Kenneth was talking about. Are you living in a way that's integral or that corresponds to your belief? Because if you don't, then it seems like the purpose of knowledge, which is just to guide the way you live, isn't serving its purpose. And so why do you believe in those things? And I go from there.
Him has no sin, cast the first stone.
Yeah. Okay. And now we go to the one that we have been waiting for, which is
Lad.
yeah.
Oh my goodness.
I had a lot of fun. It's kind of hard to read.
I mean, it's a short-ish book.
Oh, the title. Yeah.
Short-ish.
Okay. I'm disappointed now.
It's not a novella. It's like your
Yeah.
average.
So how can you?
Oh, you just click it onto your
I have a hard time.
You know,
Okay. Okay.
So, Episcopalian 2 out of 2 tonight.
Yeah, the other Anglo bro in the chat. All right.
Yeah, just go over the introduction and the prophecy section just to save time. And we'll all
Are you
watch
heading
the
out?
video of the rest of it. I'm not heading out, I just need to sit down.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right, perfect. So yeah. Oh wait. So what do I do? Okay, I see.
Innocent
Okay.
space or whatever.
All right, perfect. So as you can see, I had a lot of fun putting this title slide together. I've wanted to do this presentation for a long time. I know Alan has been looking forward to it too. Where'd he go? Whatever, man. We don't need him. Oh, is it time already? I didn't even get to do my presentation, and the rapture started. Yeah. So, the Book of Daniel. It's like one of those. It's one of the books of all time. Okay. I don't know how else to describe it. It is like. It is mind-blowing. It is dense, and it has inspired so much controversy. This book is a soft spot for me. Okay, it's like it has become one of the cornerstones of my faith because it's just so freaking mind-blowing. All right, I went through a period of doubt for a while, and when I read the Book of Daniel, it pulled me out of that. It just completely erased all the doubts that I had because it's so complex, so dense, and so amazing. And my hope is that with this presentation, you will also have the same appreciation for the Book of Daniel that I do. Because it's really my favorite book in the Bible. And I'm telling you, even if I didn't have the Gospels, I would still be a Christian because of this book. Because it's really just that powerful. So, without further ado, let's begin. All right, table of contents. So, originally I had 3 sections planned for this talk, but to cut down on time, we're just going to do a little bit of an introduction and then skip. Wait, why is it all 1, 1, 1?
You only get one section.
Yeah.
We're only gonna go.
I just assumed, I guess it was numbering correctly. I guess it's whatever.
Oh, it is, yeah. No, it isn't.
I guess we're just all going to kind of run it through together. But, so, I really want to do a presentation on this stuff, on what I consider to be proof. I know it's a bold claim, but hear me out, guys. All right? I think it is proof. I think we do have proof of the Christian faith in the Book of Daniel, but there's all these other problems with it. There's a lot of reasons skeptics won't even begin to engage with you on the Book of Daniel because problems with the dating, problems with historical reliability. Apparently, Daniel gets history wrong. And we're going to go through some of that. I'm just going to give you a nice little sampler tonight, and then hopefully you'll do your own homework and come to your own conclusions. But yeah, so I wanted to get this stuff out of the way before I can get to this. So what we're going to do instead is I'm going to touch briefly on some of these topics, and then we're just going to skip right to the end. So without further ado, let's get started. So I'm going to touch briefly on the dating of Daniel. Why does the dating of Daniel matter? So let's do some context first. Book of Daniel is broken up into 2 parts. So the first part is the life of Daniel, and it's written in Aramaic. And I'm sure y'all know some stories from the Book of Daniel that comes from the first half. Does anyone know the 3 friends of Daniel? The names off the top of your head? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fire with the angel. And then you have Daniel in the lion's den. I included a picture of that too. I mean, these are like timeless stories. They're really good. They're a lot of fun. I grew up with them. I love these stories, right? That's just the first half. First half is pretty cool. Second half is where things get weird. Yeah, I don't even know what to do with that. So the second half is actually written in another language. First half is in Aramaic. Second half is in Hebrew. And it covers the visions of Daniel. So you have the 4 beasts, the 70 weeks, the Greeks, etc. We're going to get to that. And they're weird. They're weird visions, but a lot of visions in the Old Testament, like think of Ezekiel, are packed with meaning. And so they come off as weird at first, but then once you unpack it, you can really just see just how beautiful it all is, how it all just is woven together in this beautiful tapestry. And so, yeah, let's get to it. So let's start about the context here. Why does the dating of Daniel matter?
So now that we got, what Daniel is out of the way, let's talk about the dating. So this debate started first between Jerome, he's this guy right here, he's not too happy, and then Porphyry. Porphyry, I actually quite like Porphyry. Porphyry is a Neoplatonist philosopher living in the 4th century, 80, somewhere around there, Roman Empire. He's cool because he believes in God and he likes Plato and he gives a lot of great arguments for God. He's not a Christian though, because the Neoplatonists had their own scriptures that they thought were inspired, the Chaldean oracles. Anyways, a lot of lore, you don't need to know that. And he had a lot of problems with Christianity. One of the problems he had was the book of Daniel, because Daniel 11 is in the second half, and it covers this history between the death of Alexander the Great, and Antiochus Epiphanes. And we'll talk about who that is later. But it covers this period in history. So after Alexander died, his empire was split up between all of his generals. And Daniel goes into a lot of detail about this period in history. So he talks about Daniel 11, he talks about who's going to marry who. He talks about different alliances. He talks about who's going to be king, this guy's going to kill this guy. A lot of detail. A lot of things that he could not have possibly known. And so we're left with two options. Either Daniel is a prophet and he predicted all this beforehand, which that would be amazing. That would be undeniable proof of Christianity. If we can prove that Daniel had this hindsight, right? The other possibility is that he's just making it up. He's just writing after the fact, right? And also, I had little transitions.
Oh, I'm sorry. Do you want to do it on this Google Slides?
Yeah, is that possible? Okay. It's not checking my flow, okay? So,
here, just keep going, because we are kind of short on time.
Yeah, so that's the debate, right? Jerome is trying to respond to Porphyry, and his response, it didn't age well. I actually read it, and he opens in the opening paragraph, he says, brothers and sisters, pray for me that I can absolutely demolish this guy, put to bed all these arguments, and we can move on and be happy. That didn't happen, okay? Because Jerome had a point. It's hard to prove, especially back then when we didn't have archaeology and stuff, to prove that Daniel was writing when he said he did. And I guess I should have gone over that in the context. So Daniel, the first half of the book of Daniel is the life of Daniel that takes place during the Babylonian exile. And that would be the 6th century BC, so 600s, roughly, 500s roughly. During the Babylonian exile, the events he's describing with Alexander the Great and his generals and all that stuff, that comes centuries later. And so what happened was, Porphyry made these arguments, and then skeptics in the Enlightenment era in the 1700s revived these arguments. The only reason we know about Porphyry's objections is because Jerome recorded them. So ironically, he was trying to defeat Porphyry, but in so responding to Porphyry, we actually have his arguments, and it led to them being revived, which is ironic, but a little bit of an L, But so they revived these arguments in the 1700s, basically saying, Daniel's a false prophet. He's writing after, and they said he was writing during the Maccabean revolt. This is the 2nd century BC, 200 years before Christ. Well, 160 years before Christ, because a lot of the book of Daniel is focused on that. And so if he's writing during that time period and he's just pretending to prophesy all these things, that's a problem, right? And so, blank slide, wait, what is this? Okay, let's summarize the argument real quick. So this is why some skeptics refute Daniel, why they think Daniel was written late. Premise 1, prophecy is impossible. I'm sure y'all already see a problem with this and where this is going. But then we have, Daniel prophesies historical events with high accuracy, things he could not have possibly known. Since Daniel could not have known these things, he must be writing after the fact. Therefore, Daniel is a late forgery. And so, I don't even need to say it, but what's wrong with this line of reason? It's kind of circular, right? Prophecy is impossible. It's circular. And it hinges upon a little snuck premise, which is methodological naturalism. So methodological naturalism is the assumption that miracles and prophecies do not happen. And that's good for science. Okay, when we're doing science, we're learning things about the natural world, this is good. I like methodological naturalism there. I don't think it applies to this context. Because if we go with methodological naturalism, we kind of pigeonhole ourselves. So we confine ourselves to a rigid way of thinking to where the question of prophecy, whether that can even happen, isn't even a question we can entertain anymore. And so we have to sort of abandon those preconceptions before we address the dating of Daniel. Because if we go into the discussion with those preconceptions in mind, then we have just, alienated all the possibilities. It's not a good way. It's a good way to do science. Not a good way to do history. It's not a good way to address prophetic or supernatural claims. So that's the debate, right? 6th century BC, during the Babylonian exile, or it's late. And so I'm going to refer to early and late dates throughout this presentation. It might get a little bit confusing. Just think, if you're turning an exam into your professor and you turn it in late, you're going to get a 0, and we don't want that. So late date is bad. Just remember that, because it can get confusing. When I was reading about it, I was getting confused. Was late 6th century? Anyways, so late dating. So yeah, I mean, those are the problems with late dating. We already kind of summarized that, right? The author would be putting words in Daniel's mouth, undermining Daniel's inspiration. It would have been written during the Antiochene persecution to spur his fellow Jews on. That's the opinion of critical scholarship. So this was written during the Antiochene persecution. So let's talk about that for a bit. So what's the Antiochene persecution? I want to quiz you guys on your history. Huh? Yeah, so how much time do I have?
I kind of
57.
finish, like, within 15 minutes.
Okay, I'll start a timer. Yeah, good point. All right, let's just talk about this real quick. So Antiochus Epiphanes takes the throne. He is part of the Seleucid dynasty. So Alexander's empire breaks up between all of his generals. The Seleucids take over Israel, the land of Israel, and then Seleucus, which is the name of the general, has all these kids. He has his dynasty. Antiochus Epiphanes is one of the kings in that dynasty, and he takes his throne. Takes the throne through a series of political assassinations and stuff. It's not a good guy. Then the Jewish high priest Onias dies. Note the date, 171 BC. This is pretty important. And then you have 2 priests who try to succeed him, Jason and Menelaus, and they try to buy the office of the high priest from Antiochus Epiphanes. The Torah says not to do this, okay? It's a really bad idea. But they try to bid their way into this, try to outbid each other, auction off the high priest. Don't recommend that. Menelaus outbids Jason, and he becomes high priest. Then Antiochus Epiphanes has to address problems to the south. So in the south, one of the generals of Alexander was Ptolemy, and he started the Ptolemaic dynasty, Ptolemaic Egypt. And so his successors are down in Egypt, and they attack the Seleucids. They attack north. And so Antiochus responds. He pushes them all the way back to their capital. And in one famous episode, he's about to crush them once and for all. This centuries-long feud between the 2 dynasties is finally going to come to an end. He's about to march on Alexandria, and then the Romans intervene. Now, the Romans, they don't really like either side. What they're trying to do is they're trying to maintain the balance of power in the Middle East so they can carve it out themselves. They want them fighting because it serves their own interests, right? So they come in. One of the Roman senators draws a line in the sand in front of Antiochus Epiphanes. He says, if you take one step forward, you have declared war on Rome. And Antiochus didn't really want to fight the Romans, so he backs off. But he's not happy about this, okay? And then back home, on top of that, Jason overthrows Menelaus. So both these things happen. Antiochus is coming back. He's not happy. And then he just hears that his top guy has been overthrown by by Jason. And so he's pretty mad. Just a little bit mad. When we talk about the top crash outs in all of history, right? That have made history, this is easily top 5, okay? He goes back to Israel, and he establishes a temple to Zeus in the Holy of Holies inside the Jewish temple. Note the date, 167 BC, that's pretty important. Then he commits genocide, slaughters thousands of people in Jerusalem, and forces them to perform pagan sacrifices under the pain of death, forces them to renounce their religion and accept paganism. That's where the dispute between the Samaritans and the Jews comes from, because the Samaritans allied with the Greeks and abandoned the Torah and all that. So when you hear about that in the gospel, they're kind of seen as like race traders, right? And then while this is going on, while he's persecuting the people in Jerusalem, the Parthians invade. Parthians are Persians. They're towards the northeast, and they start coming into his territory. So it's just a mess. It's just a chaotic mess, but it gets messier. So while he leaves to go take care of the Persians that are invading, the Maccabees revolt. The Maccabees are a Jewish family, Jewish clan in Israel. And the story goes that Judas Maccabee, he was told by a Greek soldier, hey, you've got to perform the sacrifice. I want to see you do it. And sacrifice his pig, basically, to this pagan god. He refused to do it. And so he was going to die. He was going to be executed. He was fine with that. But then another Jew steps in his place and says, no, wait, don't execute him. I will perform the sacrifice on his behalf, on Judas's behalf. So the guy goes to do the sacrifice, and Judas Maccabee kills him in cold blood, murders this guy in front of the Greek soldier, and then he runs away. He flees to the hills, gathers up with his clan, his family, and then they start launching guerrilla campaigns against the Greeks. They start fighting back. And so, yeah, it's a mess. And then Antiochus dies from a plague that literally makes him rot from the inside out. And so the Jews saw that, and they're like, okay, yeah, that guy was definitely cursed by God. That's what happens when he set up an altar to Zeus in the temple. And note the date, 164 BC. Then, same year, the Maccabees cleansed the temple, and that's where we get Hanukkah from. And then Judas Maccabees dies defending Jerusalem after, Antiochus dies and all that. But the Jews eventually get independence. It's a long process, but they eventually get it. And yeah, so that's the timeline, right? So it happens from 171 to 164 BC. How many years is that? 7 years. So why is that significant? Why is the number 7 significant in the Bible?
Lots of books use it in groupings of prophecies. It's like the third most common number.
It's an important number. It's a God number, yeah? Number of perfection, right? It's how long it took for God to bring things into creation. He created the earth and heavens in 6 days and rested on the seventh, right? The seventh day is the Sabbath. Keep it holy. That's an important number, and the author of Daniel picks up on this. Okay, he's obsessed with the number 7. And then also this date too, right? This period, right? Between the abomination of desolation, this happens right in between all this chaos. Right in the middle, you have the abomination of desolation set up. And then you have this 3.5-year gap between that and when he dies. So during that 3.5-year gap, that's when the Jews are being persecuted. And this is a theme, this is a motif that Daniel is obsessed with, right? Just the order in which things happen. So Daniel describes these events to the T. That makes scholars raise an eyebrow because they're thinking, okay, if this is written during the Babylonian exile, why is he so obsessed with events that happened 400 years later? So, yeah, let's go back to the late date, right? So this was written during the Antiochian persecution. And that's to summarize the skeptical perspective. Now you can see kind of why skeptics go with that argument, right? They sort of abandoned Porphyry's argument because it is a little bit weak, and now they're dating it based on the internal evidence. And so then there's another perspective, which is the early date, which is that Daniel was written when he says it was, right? It was written during the Babylonian exile, and he is a genuine prophet, right? And so the stakes here, I hope you can see, are all or nothing. Either Daniel was written early, or he's a fraud. That's at least the way people frame it, but as we're going to see, the conversation is a little bit more nuanced than that. So a lot of conservative scholars use this argument, right? Jesus quotes from, that's the other thing I want to mention too, I forgot about that. Jesus quotes from the book of Daniel. So we can't just throw this book out and say, okay, if it's not inspired, let's just toss it out. You can't do that because Jesus quotes from it, and he treats it as authoritative. So if it really is true that Daniel's a fraud and we throw this out, what does that say about Jesus? That's not good, right? And he also calls himself the Son of Man, another reference to a character in the book of Daniel. And so here's the argument that you hear from early daters. Not all early daters, but this is one of the arguments that I feel like almost made me lose my faith. Because when I started looking at this for the first time, a lot of conservative evangelical scholars will use this argument, right? If Jesus said it's true, it must be true. We don't even need to look at the evidence. Okay, that's not a quote by ABR. I just threw that in there because I feel like that's something ABR would say. Associates of Biblical Research. If you know, you know. But that's not something that they directly said. What's the problem with that argument? Just like very quickly. It's circular as well, right? The point is, like, the dating of Daniel is an independent claim. If Jesus says 2 + 2 = 3, does that mean 2 + 2 = 3? No, okay? You can't, this argument, for the Bible tells me so. I don't know if y'all know where that jingle comes from. Jesus loves me, this I know. Yeah, that doesn't work as an argument. We're going to throw that out, okay? We've got to look at the evidence on its own merits. And what that requires us to do is sometimes to take off our apologist hat and put on our neutral historian hat. And just look at the evidence on its own merits. And then once we've established the facts, then we can put our apologist hat back on and then figure out, okay, what do we do with this? How do we reconcile with this, right? And so that means getting rid of methodological naturalism, dropping those assumptions, but also doing away with wishful thinking. Just because we want Daniel to be early doesn't mean it is, even if we really, really want it. So, yeah, understand each argument on its own merits. That's, I think, the right way to approach this. And as I did some digging, it turns out the arguments for the early date are a lot better than that. So you don't need to worry. Then there's the Aramaic. I'm going to skip this section really quickly. Prayer of Nabonidus, blah, blah, blah. Let's do this. Let's just focus on one part of the problem.
I wonder if you want to focus, maybe give us the early dating argument and have that be it, and then you have a lot more credence for the prophecies that are fulfilled in there, because they have come over and
yeah.
said we need to leave eventually.
I'll leave it. Okay, fine. Okay, let's do this. So, all right, I'll wrap this up very quickly. So, arguments for the early dating rely on the internal evidence. Dating of the Hebrew and the Aramaic. Aramaic is very old. The kind of Aramaic that was only spoken in the Babylonian high courts. Same with the Hebrew. The Hebrew is also very ancient as well. So there's arguments on that side, on both sides of the aisle when it comes to that. There's also other internal evidence, like the fact that Daniel gets his history right in a lot of places. So it's not in this slide. Another slide I show how scholars didn't believe that Belshazzar, he plays an important role in the book of Daniel, right? They didn't believe he existed. They thought, okay, this is a fictitious character that someone is making up. Then they found the Nabonidus Chronicle, which is the stone tablet written by Nabonidus where he mentions his son Belshazzar. So that's pretty cool, right? So that's something that people didn't even know for hundreds of years till they discovered it in the 1800s. So, okay, if people didn't know that for hundreds of years, how could Daniel have gotten it right? Right? So that would lend more credence to the early date. Of course, there's arguments on both sides, but that's like a very high overview. And my hope is that y'all will do your own research. But what I do want to talk about, so we can get to the good stuff, is this topic of genre. So the question is, how can genre affect truth claims? And I'll explain why it ties in a minute. So if I say, there's this guy, Peter Parker, okay, he can climb walls, he can shoot webs. Am I a liar, necessarily? It depends on the context, right? If I'm writing fiction, no. If I'm writing history, yes. And so the ancient world's a lot more diverse than we think. Okay, there's a lot of different genres. And one of them is the apocalyptic genre, which we'll talk about, okay? Apocalypse in Greek means revealing or unveiling, right? And there's lots of examples of this. So 2nd Baruch, Assumption of Moses, 1st and 2nd Enoch, those are all apocalyptic genres. And the way it works is it's usually some guy describing current events through the lens of a historical figure. So they'll have Moses, for instance, receiving this vision of the future, of the destruction of the temple, let's say in the 1st century. And they'll talk about the destruction of the temple, but through that lens, and show how God is still in control. And it's like God is revealing these things to the prophets of old, but he's also explaining on top of it. So it's a little bit of both. It's a little bit of, present commentary, social commentary, but also pseudo-prophecy. But it's really, the point of it is to teach some spiritual message, okay? and to show that God is sovereign no matter what. And so because there's so many examples of this, if you take the late date, you could say, as a faithful Christian, Daniel's not lying here. He's just sticking to a literary genre. And I think the right way to understand Daniel is to understand it first as literature, but also as prophecy. So that's basically where I lean on this. I lean towards the late date, not because of those weird arguments that prophecy isn't impossible, because of the internal evidence. It reads a lot like other apocalyptic books. But okay, there's other arguments too against that. Like, the genre of apocalypticism could be, vague, hard to define. But, one way you could frame it is that Daniel is comparing the current crisis the Jews are facing to what the prophet Daniel faced. So the author is saying, hey, look, what we're going through is just like what our ancestors went through during the exile. So we got to be faithful like Daniel. All right, cool. Let's skip to the end, the good stuff. Yeah, no kidding.
You can scroll.
I can scroll. You guys can see this, right? Y'all are following?
We got it all. Don't
Oh
worry.
my gosh.
Oh, that's everything.
Yeah. Okay, good. The proof. You see, this is proof. Yeah. All right, now this is the good stuff. Y'all have been waiting for it. Let's blitz through it. All right, Daniel 7, you have the prophecy of the 4 beasts that come out of the water. They have weird descriptions. What are these beasts? So, 2 places. Daniel 2, that's in the first half. Nebuchadnezzar has this dream of these statues that have 4 layers. Head of gold, body of silver. You guys see it, okay? And then the same prophecy appears again, except instead of Nebuchadnezzar having this dream, it's Daniel. And instead of a statue, it's these beasts. And there's a parallel here. All right, what's the first head of gold? So first head of gold is an empire. I'm sure y'all can guess it. I'll help you out. It's Babylon. So Babylon is the head of gold, and it's also the lion in Daniel. So, and then there's some evidence for that. Okay. Oh, shoot. Second one would be the Persians. The Persians come in, they liberate the Jews, right? And it's not just the Persian, it's also the Medes. There's an alliance there, okay? Persian-Median Empire. And then you have the cheetah, which has 4 heads, and it's fast. What does that represent? Alexander the Great. Perfect. And then you have the last, I just skipped ahead. You have the last beast, which most scholars think is the Seleucids. That's when Daniel is writing, right? But hear me out. I think it's also Rome. And I think Rome actually fits better. Let's talk about that. Why does Rome fit better? Okay. Again, summary, we just covered that. Daniel 7. This is the description of the 4th beast. It's terrifying. It's dreadful. It tramples everything underfoot. It conquers the whole world. And here's the key thing. It has 10 horns. And while I was contemplating the horns, suddenly 1 horn came up, so 11 horns now. And it uproots 3 before them. And then it has eyes of a man. We know who that man is. Okay, it's Antiochus Epiphanes. Let's talk about that. So here is the list of kings from the Seleucid dynasty. As you can see, it adds up to 11. And then here are the people that Antiochus Epiphanes kind of, except this guy. Thankfully, he's still in Rome. There's like a hostage exchange. I'm not going to go into it. So these people never ruled. So how could they be horns, right? Now let's look at the Roman dynasty. We count up the Roman dynasty. We end up with this guy Vespasian. Why is Vespasian important? Does anyone know their history? That's okay. I'm going to give you a crash course. Vespasian actually, yes, you're going to say, Rob? Exactly. 70 AD, he marches against Jerusalem and he destroys the temple. He also, 3 people before him, in what's called the Year of the 4 Emperors. So he wasn't directly involved in their assassinations, but he came out on top, okay? It was a Game of Thrones episode, literally, right? What happened was Nero offed himself, he die, and then it was a free-for-all between these 4 generals. Vespasian comes out on top. How amazing is that? That it just happens to line up, right? It just seems like these 2 historical events, these 2 timelines are, he destroys the temple. Daniel 9:26 actually uses the word destroy. So when Daniel is describing the destruction of the temple, we know he's talking about the defilement under Antiochus Epiphanes. That's the way it's traditionally read. But he actually says that Antiochus, this person, this mysterious 11th horn, destroys the temple. That would fit more with Vespasian. So yeah, these two timelines are lined up almost perfectly, almost exactly. I don't think that's a coincidence. And we're going to see more evidence of that. So before that, why do we count at Pompey? Pompey's not really an emperor. I had some slides about why I include Pompey. I don't just need it because the timelines need to match up. There's actually a good case for Pompey. Pompey annexed Judea.
You got to wrap up.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Shoot. Anyways, Pompey is the first one. If you want to know why, talk to me after. Then you have the Jewish-Roman War. Lines up perfectly with what we talked about before. It's a 7-year war, and in between, the Jewish temple is destroyed. And then you have this 3.5-year period when Masada falls. That's the end of it. And then also, it wasn't Vespasian that destroyed the temple. Correction, Rob. It was actually Titus, his son. Why is that important? Because, okay, an anointed one, we know the anointed one is Onias, the high priest. Anointed in Hebrew is actually Mashiach. It means Messiah. So a Messiah must die. And then also, I don't include it here, but it says in Daniel that the prince of the person who's going to come to destroy the city will actually do it. So that fits more with Titus, right? And then you have this prophecy about an anointed one, right? That's the Messiah. We know who that is. Big J. And then, so it's like after Jesus dies, then the Romans come in, and then you have this war. And what's amazing is that Jesus prophesied this would happen. He tells the people that are alive at that time that the book of Daniel will be fulfilled in their own lifetime. He says, when you see the abomination of desolation, which is a reference to the book of Daniel, flee, get out of Jerusalem and go to the mountains. So, and then Josephus talks about this. He notices the parallels. He says, this is far too coincidental. The book of Daniel was fulfilled in our time. But he doesn't notice that detail about an anointed one dying. If he did, if he knew that referred to Jesus, I think he would have been well on his way to accepting Christianity. But he didn't notice it. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's much more evidence. But we don't have time for that. The fifth kingdom fills the whole earth. Then you have the beast that's slain. The beast in the book of Daniel, this fourth beast is eventually slain. Of course I have to add the fire. Of course I do. And then you have this figure, the Son of Man, coming on clouds who accepts the kingdom of the earth, of all the earths. He's worshipped. You see Jesus refer to that figure as himself. He says, I am the Son of Man. And then, of course, you see the conversion of the Roman Empire and the spread of Christianity throughout the whole world. These are just far too many coincidences. This is why I think it's a double fulfillment. This is why I think we have a case of fulfilled prophecy in here that proves the inspiration of Scripture. And as final reading, so skeptics cry pareidolia. To that, I say Jesus himself said this would happen. So what are the chances that Jesus actually knew what he was talking about? I think they're pretty high because Jesus expected this. The early Jesus movement saw this, right? They taught this, and it came true. They could not have possibly known that 2,000 years from now, we would still be talking about this. Okay, that is a remarkable coincidence. Then I do a little bit about typology. If you want to know more about typology, here's a book. Good book. Yeah, do you want to just end it there?
Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
So that's to say that the book of Daniel works really well even under the late authorship.
Yes.
Yeah. And late is what it is now. So thank you. Thank you. That was actually really interesting, and I do want to hear more about that. Thank you all for staying a little bit later, significantly later than we normally would, but you've been paid in pizza, so I don't feel too bad about that. We have a nice 2 weeks coming up. Our last normal talk is next Tuesday. We're going to talk about the historical reliability of the Old Testament and whether the text was transmitted accurately. And then finally, we will have our end of semester party with the customary Reasonable Faith Jeopardy, and I think we're going to have chili at that time. So hope to see y'all in the next 2 Tuesdays. Thanks for being here.